The sun hadn't yet risen when whispers turned into shouts inside the palace walls, and by morning, the monarchy would never be the same. At first, the news arrived like a cruel joke passed between weary aides and half-awake courtiers. But soon it became undeniable. Prince William had issued a direct order to sever all financial ties to Queen Camilla's extended family. No more quiet stipends, no more discreet property maintenance payments, no more allowances disguised as charitable retainers. Just silence, where once there was a steady flow of royal largesse. The media caught the scent before the ink on William's command was dry. By dawn, headlines screamed of a family torn asunder. "William cuts off Camilla clan," blared the Daily Mirror. Breakfast shows rattled off hashtags, already trending across continents. Number crown control, number royal rift, number Windsor war. Commentators speculate wildly, grasping at clues to explain the heir's sudden, almost violent act of defiance. How could he risk this much? Why now? It didn't take long for the answer to surface: a single damning audio file. A leak. A confession. Camilla's ex-husband, Andrew Parker, B.S., had recorded a private memoir intended only for his children, which instead detonated inside the monarchy like a hidden mine. His gravelly voice laid bare what he claimed were her darkest secrets, sending shockwaves through the quiet corridors of power. Fear clung to the walls as aides scurried to contain what no longer could be contained. Disbelief, too, settled over the palace. Even in an institution that had survived centuries of betrayal, abdications, and scandal, few could believe that the heir to the throne would publicly renounce the family of his father's wife. Fewer still could imagine the depths of what this leak revealed. And yet, beneath the outrage and the whispers, a more dangerous curiosity began to take hold. What kind of secrets could force William to risk everything? To understand the ferocity of William's decision, we must first unravel the tangled web of love, betrayal, and ambition that brought them here. It all started with a single file, a private confession never meant for the world to hear. But once released, it exploded like a bomb in a drawing room. Somewhere deep in the English countryside, Andrew Parker, B.S., sat down to record his memories for his children, a quiet reckoning with the past, a voice cracking under the weight of what had been left unsaid for decades. But when that file slipped from his family's hands and into the digital wild, the monarchy's fragile facade shattered overnight. His words dripped with the kind of bitterness that only betrayal can ferment. In his gravelly voice, Andrew accused Camilla not just of infidelity, though that alone was damning enough, but of something far more insidious. He spoke of a woman who, behind her disarming smile, built an empire of influence and money in the shadows. He painted her as a strategist who manipulated finances and emotions alike, who played a long game not merely for love, but for dominion. "The kingdom," he intoned, "rests on a delusion." Those words ricocheted through encrypted forums and podcasts before being plastered across headlines and screens around the globe. Within hours, what had started as a whispered confession became an international scandal, with 1,000 tongues retelling it. Palace aides scrambled to verify the claims, some too shocked to speak, others already bracing for impact. William, who had spent years holding his tongue and his temper in equal measure, summoned his most trusted advisors before dawn. The air inside Kensington Palace grew heavy as legal teams, financial auditors, and personal confidants filed into the study. They listened together to the full recording, to the venom, the grief, and the accusations that stripped the royal family bare. Every word was a dagger, and every dagger demanded a response. Advisors warned caution. Some argued the public might tire of the drama, that silence could preserve what little dignity remained. Others, younger and bolder, insisted that inaction would look like complicity. William stood between these warring camps, the weight of the crown's future pressing down on him. In that suffocating room, with the sound of his mother's name faintly echoing from portraits on the wall, he faced an impossible choice: protect the family's illusion or rip away its veil. Under immense pressure and with his conscience burning hotter than fear, he chose the latter. The decision was as swift as it was ruthless. But how did a charming soldier and a witty debutante become the central figures in this royal reckoning? Their story begins decades earlier. Long before she was queen, Camilla was a girl with a spark, and Andrew was her mirror in rebellion. Until the fairy tale began to crack. Their story began on a sunlit afternoon in the 1960s, when a Windsor polo match brought the English elite together in a whirl of champagne and horse sweat. Among the riders and debutantes, Andrew Parker, B.S., spotted her a young woman who laughed too easily, who smoked with an irreverence that belied her breeding. who made even the most pompous dukes stumble over their words. Camilla, for her part, saw in Andrew a soldier's charm and a hint of danger, a man who moved through privilege with the ease of someone unimpressed by it. Sparks flew instantly, and they didn't bother to hide them. Within months, they were inseparable, their names whispered at country house parties and splashed across society columns. When Andrew proposed, it seemed inevitable. There was a match that pleased the world. He, the dashing cavalry officer with royal connections. She, the earthy yet dazzling daughter of the Sussex countryside. Their wedding was hailed as the union of two souls who defied stuffy conventions yet embodied the aristocratic ideal. They settled into a glamorous life on weekends at Bullhyde Manor, children born into privilege, their photographs gracing the pages of Tatler as the perfect family tableau. For a while, it was easy to believe they had it all, but behind the dazzling facade, cracks had already begun to form. Infidelity, though quiet, was never far from their marriage. Andrew admitted years later that he had his indiscretions. It was, as he put it, the culture. Yet he claimed Camilla's betrayals were different, more calculating. Ambition flickered beneath her easy smile, ambition that grew sharper with every passing year. She seemed restless in the role of country wife and mother, her wit too sharp, her gaze too far-reaching, to stay content within Bullhyde's sunlit gardens. When Prince Charles returned from his naval duty in the early 1970s, Camilla's heart, and perhaps more importantly, her mind began to drift. Their connection, though paused during his absence, reignited quietly but fiercely. Andrew watched helplessly as she slipped away, not in one dramatic gesture, but in 1,000 small ones. A longer phone call here, a late return from London there, whispers of meetings he wasn't invited to. In later years he would confess with a bitter clarity that he had become a placeholder in her grander plan. Even then, he claimed to see what others could not, that Camilla was not merely chasing affection, but positioning herself for something much greater. But it wasn't just her heart that drifted, it was her mind, scheming a climb towards something much greater. Behind closed doors, Camilla began weaving a financial web so intricate, even seasoned auditors struggled to follow the threads. As her marriage to Andrew deteriorated, and her connection to Charles deepened, she moved quietly, but deliberately, into another arena, entirely one far removed from polo fields and dinner parties. According to Andrew, this was the period when Camilla's true ambition revealed itself, not merely for affection or influence, but for power secured through wealth, hidden from the world yet binding in its reach. He claimed she began constructing a labyrinth of offshore trusts, shell companies, and discreet charitable entities, each more opaque than the last, designed to insulate her from scrutiny and fortify her standing within the royal orbit. These mechanisms, he insisted, were never accidents. They were allegedly designed to protect Charles's vast holdings from prying eyes, to shield debts that would have embarrassed the monarchy, and most crucially, to create a grip on the institution that could not be broken without tearing at the fabric of its finances. Andrew described her as masterful at exploiting every gap in oversight, turning centuries of royal precedent to her advantage, and laying traps that even the monarchy's lawyers would hesitate to untangle. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, fragmented documents and suspicious leaks lent weight to his claims, hinting at a network of transactions impossible to explain away as simple coincidence. An ex-royal auditor, who spoke on condition of anonymity, admitted years later that her fingerprints were on every covert plan. He described how seemingly benign charities and heritage trusts redirected funds to entities controlled by her allies, and how properties were shuffled into holding companies registered far from British soil. Even within palace walls, whispers began to circulate, though no one dared speak openly. Camilla's financial maneuvers, cloaked in legitimacy but reeking of strategy, became part of her quiet legend. A woman who didn't just navigate power, but who bought her own version of it, and buried the receipts deep enough to escape daylight. By the time William's team undertook their investigation decades later, what they uncovered was staggering. More than £5 million a year flowed legally, but quietly, from royal accounts to Camilla's extended family through these obscure vehicles. Properties maintained under shadowy contracts. Educational bursaries distributed to cousins. Retainers paid to advisors of advisors. None of it is criminal. All of it was explosive. Yet beyond the balance sheets lay a much heavier toll: the emotional wreckage left in the wake of her ambition. Behind every grand maneuver, there are quiet victims. and in this case, they were her own family and his. While Camilla built her hidden empire and drew closer to Charles, the life she shared with Andrew began to splinter in silence, and then shatter in noise. Andrew later described those years as a slow erosion, where conversations turned into arguments, arguments into silence, and silence into something darker. Nights were punctuated by slammed doors and muffled voices behind walls too thin to keep the children from hearing. He spoke of tears that fell quietly over foreign bank statements found in her desk drawers, of bitter words exchanged under the gaze of family portraits that once stood for unity. For their children, Laura and Tom, the grandeur of Bullhide Manor was no sanctuary. They would later call their home a corridor between fairy tale and storm, a place where the garden glistened with sunlight while inside, shadows stretched long and cold. They learned early how to pretend to smile at dinner parties, to stand straight at public events, to speak when spoken to, and say nothing more. But behind closed doors, they lived with confusion, feeling themselves trapped between two worlds: the story their parents presented to the outside world, and the truth that clawed at them every day. Even after the divorce in 1995, when the final legal severance was signed, the emotional bonds remained frayed but unbroken. Andrew recounted the final words Camilla said to him before she left, words that still cut him years later. "You were always the bridge," she told him, a chilling admission that their marriage had been less about love and more about what it allowed her to reach. Andrew, stunned, realized then that their years together had merely served as a crossing point between the woman she was and the woman she intended to become. Meanwhile, as she and Charles became ever more inseparable, Andrew retreated into the quiet of the countryside. He remarried a woman named Rosemary, not out of passion but out of a need for peace. He filled his days with horse trials and grandchildren, but even there, among the rolling hills of Wiltshire, he could never quite escape the echo of what had been taken from him. The human cost of Camilla's ambition became undeniable. Fractured families, disillusioned children, and wounds that refused to heal haunted all of them. Yet, through it all, she rose higher, undeterred. And as she climbed, William watched silently from the sidelines until the past collided violently with the present. When the time came to choose between peace and principle, William drew a line in the sand. The leak had left the palace in chaos, aides darting between offices, advisors whispering over shredded documents, and phones ringing with demands from a public hungry for answers. William stood in the middle of it all, silent at first, but with a quiet fury building beneath his calm exterior. He summoned his most trusted legal and financial advisors into the study, the room heavy with the ghosts of choices made by monarchs before him. One by one, they presented him with options. Some pleaded for restraint, warning of a storm if he acted too rashly. Others, emboldened by the tide of public opinion, urged him to cut ties without mercy. And yet, William hesitated. Even as revelations mounted, millions flowing quietly to Camilla's family through veiled trusts and clandestine stipends, he felt the weight of what his decision would mean. This was no longer just about money. It was about loyalty, about duty, about rewriting the unspoken compromises that had held his family together. Catherine, still battling her own health and privacy struggles, found the strength to offer him counsel. "Do nothing in anger," she told him, her words both gentle and sharp. But behind them, he sensed her quiet resolve, that doing nothing at all was no longer an option. Then came the final dossier, laid before him by his chief auditor, a neat bundle of pages that cut through every doubt. There it was, in black and white. Millions siphoned off, distributed through a maze of entities to Camilla's relatives, year after year. Not illegal, but indefensible. Every figure felt like another crack in the foundation of the crown he was destined to inherit. Outside the palace walls, the world roared. Hashtags blazed across social media, number Royal Rift, number William the Just. Even number Camillagate trended globally. Polls swung heavily in his favor, with a weary public hungry for accountability, cheering his every move. But William knew better than to mistake applause for safety. What he was about to do would shatter the fragile peace his father had spent years trying to build. At midnight, after pacing the length of his mother's old study one final time, he signed the decree. The language was spare, almost surgical, but its meaning was unmistakable. All financial support to Camilla's extended family would end, effective immediately. For better or worse, the line had been drawn. The heir had chosen principle over precedent, and the monarchy would never be the same. The decision unleashed a chain reaction that no one could fully control. The royal facade crumbled overnight, as alliances fractured and secrets spilled like spilled ink. By dawn, newspapers screamed of a monarchy at war with itself, calling it the great divorce of money, not love. Commentators, former courtiers, and even foreign dignitaries weighed in as though the palace had become an open stage. The public watched in fascination and horror as the gilded illusion of unity collapsed into a tangled mess of conflicting loyalties, bitter silence, and barely contained rage. The very air inside Buckingham and Kensington seemed to thrum with accusations that no one dared say aloud. In the middle of this storm stood Charles, caught between his son and his wife, frozen by the impossible choice forced upon him. His official statement, issued quietly by the palace press office, was little more than a whisper drowned by the roar outside. His Majesty retains full confidence in both the Queen and the Prince of Wales, it read, the words so neutral they fooled no one. Behind closed doors, those closest to him said his silence was not indifference, but paralysis, a king torn between love and legacy. Camilla, on the other hand, did not remain silent. She retreated from public view, yes, but she was far from beaten. Furious yet unnervingly composed, she unleashed her legal team with orders to correct the record. Statements were drafted, allegations were rebutted as selective, subjective, and materially false. Her inner circle began to murmur that William had crossed a line he might regret, that the Queen Consort was not a woman easily destroyed. Friends called her steel under pressure, insisting she had survived worse before and would do so again. Beyond the gates, the clash of ideologies reached a fever pitch. Outside Buckingham Palace, monarchists waved banners proclaiming loyalty to the crown, while Republican activists shouted for its abolition. Police struggled to keep the two sides apart as chants of "Expose the trusts" clashed with cries of "Long live the Queen." Across the lawns and pavements, the confrontation became a metaphor for the monarchy itself split down the middle, yet stubbornly refusing to break. Meanwhile, the world watched with an intensity that unnerved even the most seasoned historians. Commentators began drawing parallels to Edward VIII's abdication, to Wallis Simpson's scandal, to the very moments in history where love, power, and duty collided so violently that the throne itself trembled. But this was different. This was not about a king giving up a crown for love. This was about a family fighting for its soul in an era when every misstep became a global spectacle. But the storm didn't stop at Britain's shores. It swept across the Commonwealth, shaking the very foundation of monarchy abroad. From Canberra to Kingston, the scandal ignited long-buried debates about the Crown's place in modern society. The ripple effect of William's decree moved beyond the streets of London, striking at the heart of the Commonwealth itself. In Australia, parliamentarians seized the moment, calling loudly for a new referendum on severing ties with the monarchy. Their speeches were blistering, framing the revelations about Camilla's alleged financial schemes as proof that the royal family had become a relic, a gilded institution mired in secrecy and incapable of representing a modern democracy. In Canada, the reaction was equally sharp. Politicians there spoke of accelerating legislation to replace the sovereign's image on their currency and redefine the ceremonial role of the monarchy. Some even argued that the spectacle unfolding in Britain made it impossible for Canadians to explain, let alone justify, their continued allegiance to a family embroiled in scandal. Meanwhile, across the Caribbean, where whispers of independence had been growing for years, leaders turned them into roars. Countries that had quietly planned to move away from British rule now spoke openly of timelines, of cutting the cord once and for all. In St. Vincent, in Barbados, in Jamaica, the scandal became fuel for their cause. The international media, never known for subtlety, pivoted quickly. For decades they had feasted on Camilla's love life, her rivalry with Diana, her quiet survival. But now they focused on something far more dangerous: charts, ledgers, and leaked diagrams of alleged trusts and hidden accounts. Headlines screamed of financial deception and institutional decay. Even those who had once been her staunch defenders began to question not just her actions, but the very system that had allowed them to flourish unchecked. And the public felt it. For the first time in years, trust in the monarchy dipped below 50% in polling. Hashtags that once trended with nostalgia and affection now seethed with accusations. People questioned whether the family's silence was strength or simply arrogance disguised as dignity. And yet, amid the anger and disillusionment, there were also voices who saw possibility in the chaos, who argued that William's stand could become the beginning of a new, more transparent monarchy, that his willingness to face uncomfortable truths might finally drag the institution out of the shadows and into the light. Yet, inside the palace, an even more dangerous question lingers: how does the family heal from wounds this deep? In the quiet of Buckingham's chapel, a king kneels alone, torn between love, duty, and the ghosts of the past. It is here, in the solitude of marble and shadow, that Charles faces what may be the most impossible choice of his reign. To stand by his son is to undermine the woman he has loved for decades. To defend his wife is to risk his heir's respect and the public's fragile trust. His head bowed, hands trembling, he prays not for victory but for clarity, yet clarity remains elusive. Every path ahead seems paved with loss. Beyond those walls, constitutional experts issue stark warnings. They speak of fault lines now visible in the monarchy's foundation, cracks that may widen into chasms if left unresolved. Some argue that William's unprecedented decision, however principled, threatens to set dangerous precedents. Could future heirs wield the same moral blade to cut down rivals and rewrite centuries of custom? Could suspicion take root so deeply that no royal marriage, no alliance, would ever feel secure again? The very stability of the crown hangs in the balance, and whispers of abdication once unthinkable slip through hushed conversations. Within the palace, debates rage over possible resolutions. One camp urges a full public audit of royal finances to bear the truth completely and cleanse the institution through transparency. Others advocate quiet, private mediation between William, Camilla, and the king, a compromise that would return stipends in exchange for silence, all behind closed doors. And then there are those who insist on stonewalling entirely, gambling that the public's anger will eventually burn out and the monarchy's mystique will endure, as it always has. Each option carries its own peril. Each promises its own kind of betrayal. Through it all, William remains resolute. Friends describe him as coldly determined, a prince no longer content to inherit a crown tarnished by secrets and compromises. He does not waver, even as his father's silence cuts him to the bone, and his stepmother's lawyers strike back with surgical precision. To some, he now embodies a generational shift, a man unwilling to sacrifice integrity at the altar of tradition. To others, he is dangerously naive, underestimating the power of the institution he seeks to reform. And so, the monarchy drifts in these treacherous waters, its survival no longer assured but still possible if only those steering it can keep their hands steady. For the crown has endured murder, exile, scandal, and war, not because it was unshakable, but because it learned to bend. As history has always shown, the crown endures but only if it learns to bend before it breaks. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.